This is Modern Gaming Culture. This series will attempt to highlight the phenomenon of PC, console, and mobile gaming and bring to light all of its phenomenal aspects. Let's take a dive together into the world of modern gaming and take apart its structure. Now, here's your host, Rotimi Osagi. Alright, this is Modern Gamer Culture. This is episode 10. Modern Gamer Culture. Last episode sort of introduced this kind of style of episode that I wanted to introduce on this show, particularly to do a lot of like taking stock, right? This genre, of the mind fuck, right? And think, you know, I feel like that's a pretty important part of sort of kind of getting people up to speed, right? Particularly people who are not, immersed in gaming culture. You know, I would consider probably the best ways to immerse yourself in game culture these days, objectively, is to be, part of the Pokemon community in some way, shape, or form. I would say it's probably number one, right? Having some sort of Nintendo gaming system, particularly state of the art, like the Switch or the Switch 2. Um, I would say it's probably the number one way, I would say, of being part of gaming culture. Pokemon is definitely the biggest media franchise in the world. And so it's not something you can really take lightly, quite frankly, right? And, as we'll sort of, take apart on this show, you know, uh, Nintendo, not particularly Nintendo, but Pokemon, right? And Nintendo also, right? Are I don't know if I've talked about it on the show, in earnest, right? Where about what I call the kings of modern gamer culture, right? But yeah, Nintendo is definitely, um, if you want to say being set up, right, to be sort of, the archetypal king of modern gamer culture, right? And so I would say that, this is not something you can particularly undermine as, part of analysis of gaming culture, right? And so I would say the number one way I would say is probably participating in the Pokemon community in some way, shape, or form, right? Preferably, in a competitive fashion, right? And then I would say, if video games, isn't necessarily your speed, you can, follow games like chess, right? Um, Chess is more of a game of memorization, though, so it's not necessarily a competitive game per se, right? Um, games like Sudoku, chess, those are generally games that are memorization more than they are, you know, um, games with a lot of depth. You know, um, these are games that are generally very socially acceptable too, right? Which is generally how they generally attract their audience. Is just the fact that they're very socially acceptable games, right? But they're not necessarily games with a lot of depth that you can really take apart a lot of structure out of them, right? And so I wouldn't say that they're necessarily games that you shouldn't follow or shouldn't play, but I would not consider them gaming culture, right, or modern gaming culture, as a show is titled, right? And so yeah, I would say that's the number one way, right, that you can participate in the arena of gaming and gamer culture ultimately. Um, and so, this is something that really needs to be understood, right? This is something we're really going to talk about on the show a lot. is really understanding sort of the hierarchy of gaming, right? Really understand sort of where a lot of these games are coming from, particularly, um, and understand sort of the players, right? Not necessarily the players playing the game, but like the people who are the steers of the ship, right? The executives of these companies, right? I think out of all the more popular sort of companies that are putting out games, I think the company I follow the least, right, and generally just because the circle that I follow, right, is probably Blizzard and Epic Games, right? Those games like Hearthstone, Dota, um, Fortnite. These are games that I don't particularly follow, right? And then you have games that are on titles like on systems like Xbox and PS or PlayStation, right? And those are generally just sims. They're not necessarily games that really have been thought out and developed and put out, right? Games like Halo, Call of Duty, Rainbow Six, etc. Right? These are not necessarily, and then like FIFA, um, NBA, hockey, NFL, etc. Right? These are generally just sims. These are not necessarily games per se, right? That really need to follow a structure in order for them to work, right? These are just generally sports that are just been put onto software, right? So sims, in other words, right? And so, yeah, these are not things I generally follow. Those particularly, those titles that aren't generally on PlayStation, Xbox, generally because they're not particularly games, right? They're just sims. So that's generally a conscious choice, right? And then generally people I follow don't generally play those games either way, right? Um, and so yeah, those are generally things I don't really follow the most. Um, and then you have Epic Games and Blizzard, right, putting out these titles that are kind of antiquated games like Hearthstone and Dota, which still generally attract an audience, a large audience, but they are not influential in the realm of gaming culture in any significant fashion, right? That really needs to be investigated, right? You're not gonna have somebody come in to Hearthstone or Dota, or Fortnite and really cause a ruckus, right? Make a ruckus, and so these are not generally games that I feel are pretty influential, right? And something that we're going to get into in the show is understanding sort of kind of what role gaming culture plays in society, right? And also understanding why it's important to really have a really good body of work related to gaming culture, so you're not sort of led astray, right, by gaming culture, right? So that's something that's gonna be kind of like a mainstay topic in this show, right? So yeah, that's something I just kind of want to touch on because I realize I haven't really touched on that particularly, right? And I also just want to set the pace for these first few shows so that people really understand kind of where the show's headed, right? So that's kind of the reason why I haven't really touched on some of these other titles that attract a large audience, and also I just don't play those games, right? So yeah, so yeah, the games I generally play, I play Pokemon, right, and I play the core game and I play the trading card game, right, and then play League of Legends, right. So I play League of Legends and then I play TFT, Teamfight Tactics, which you can play out of the League of Legends client. I play Maple Story, um, play on the Rogue server, and I play on the interactive server. Recently made an interactive account. Uh, and yeah, those are generally the games I play, right? And those are generally the games I follow. And so yeah, that's generally going to be the games that I kind of draw from, right? So yeah, I don't really, I'm not really knocking games that are not on Nintendo systems or League of Legends or Maple Story stuff like that, and also Steam as well. Um, Not something I've really dabbled in either. Only game I've really played on Steam is Dawn of War, right? From the Warhammer um, franchise, the 4K Warhammer 40K franchise. I think it's a pretty cool franchise. Something I played kind of in my teens, but I haven't really, kept up with it. Um, but yeah, I think these are generally kind of like, I think these are like graveyards for shitware. Honestly, to be frank, quite frank, honestly, I'm not really interested in Steam in general. To be quite frank, I think it's just shitware. I'm not saying there's not good games on Steam. It's just honestly, they're not necessarily games that you really need to investigate in a deep fashion, right? Or really become antiquated. I mean, acquainted with, right? In order to really get a really big picture view of gamer culture, right? These games generally just attract, you know, a certain type of audience, and that's their bottom line, and that's how they put bread on their table, right? And so to each their own, right? What we're talking about here is the title of the show, right? Modern gamer culture, right? So I think I want to really make it clear what I mean by modern gamer culture, because when I start to reach the people where I really want to reach, right? I don't want these people to be bombarding me, right? With oh, why don't you play this game or this, right? Why don't you talk about this game? I want to make it very clear that I'm really trying to steer the show in a certain direction, and so I'm not going to install Steam on my computer and download Dota 2, right? It's not something that I'm not going to be doing, quite frankly, right? Um, you know, the show is about sort of taking apart the structure of gaming culture, right? And providing insight on gaming culture, kind of the happenings in gaming culture, and also helping people really, find a role model, right, in gaming culture that they can really turn to really give them insight on, the phenomena of gaming culture, right? So that's what the show's about, right? You know, um, and so again, I understand people in gaming culture, so I'm not particularly worried about, especially when I start to reach the people who I really want to reach, people, starting to bombard me with that. 'Cause I understand these people, as long as you just don't give them a platform, right? Then they're not going to be able to reach you generally, right? If they want to send you emails, like if I set up something like an email list or like a contact us type of email client, right? People want to email me whatever the fuck they want, they can do that, and I don't really care, right? Because generally, if I start to notice that people are going to start, bombarding my thing, I'm just going to probably just blacklist them, right? And then whatever they send is just going to get immediately deleted. So it's not going to become an issue, right? And I understand there's a very finite amount of people who are really going to be doing that. So it's not something I'm particularly worried about. And if it starts occurring, I'm just going to deal with it, right? So, you know, that's really when you understand the show, right? And understand also that we have a lot of stuff in the pipeline that we really want to, deliver, right, to the audience, right? And so, I want to, um, prepare people for receiving that, and also preparing people for facilitating the reception of that as well, right? So, that's something that people are really going to have to start to really investigate, the phenomena of gamer culture a lot more, right? So that they can prepare themselves for that, right? Gaming is not something that you do, for leisure, right? The purpose of gaming is to really cultivate aspects of yourself, right? And also cultivate aspects of your relationship with others. That's ultimately the main purpose of gaming, right? And so, when you have such a toxic gaming culture where, you can't even really gauge the morale of your teammates, for example, you're not going to be able to cultivate, aspects of yourself and aspects of your relationship with others, right? Because you're not even going to really be able to reach people, right? And so, this is something that I really need to make clear, right? As the show progresses is that, this is not going to be something where, I'm going to come on here and I'm going to start to, just for the sake of, satisfying people's urges or something, really pander, right, to an audience, right? I want to reach people, and I want to reach the right people, and I want them to be reached with a very sophisticated and very helpful message, right? So they can, you know, um, navigate gaming culture a lot better, right? So that's sort of the goal, right? So this show's called Modern Gamer Culture, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to be sitting here talking about Final Fantasy 16 or whatever the new Final Fantasy is. I don't even know what it is, right? And so that's something I just want to make very clear, right? Um, so this episode you kind of consider kind of like a filler episode because especially after the episode 9, right? Um, you definitely need to kind of just take a break and sort of refocus, right? And so that's sort of what this show's kind of represented, right? You know, um, that episode really helped me a lot because it really helped me kind of, flesh out a lot of stuff I really wanted to flesh out in the show. And I feel like the medium by which I did that, um, was very effective in doing that, right? And so I'm very proud of the episode, right? And hopefully, um, and get, more episodes like that. Right? I feel like that's a very effective way to reach people these days, especially too through that medium, right? And so that's something I'm going to really want to, prepare myself to do a lot too, right? And so, I haven't really checked on the episode yet, so I really don't know. All I know is it didn't get censored. know, um, so I think episode 7 it was muted on TikTok, so um, the episode didn't reach anybody on TikTok. It's just a TikTok AI, right? It's not anybody. I think a big issue when it comes to sort of internet broadcasting, internet publishing these days is really this phenomena of censorship, right? Especially now that TikTok is basically the platform that you have to use to reach people, right? Like if you're going to reach people without, basically paying for promotion, basically, right? Um, you know, TikTok is definitely the platform you're going to have to do that. So, um, you know, um, this idea of sort of censorship, especially Chinese censorship, right, is something that is a very big theme with internet publishing, internet radio, right, especially very hard hitting internet publishing, and so it's something that is something that you can't really kind of do end runs around in the sense of kind of dismissing it or not taking it seriously. It's definitely very important. It's very serious, right? I frankly don't care because I know it's just an AI doing it. It's not necessarily people that are, doing it, right? Generally, what you had before was you'd basically have, right? You'd have an AI that would basically flag accounts, right? And then someone would actually just come in and intervene, right? Now you just have an AI just doing it, and it's all just AI, right? Unless the person is very huge and then it causes a lot of internal conflict, then someone has to intervene personally. But generally, it's just an AI doing it, right? Because I don't necessarily have a giant audience yet, and so there's necessarily no reason for episodes of mine to be muted or not be able to get through checks, right? And so this is just something where now they're really taking their hands off of the censorship apparatus, right? Sort of so they can basically save their own asses, right, when it comes to PR, right? And so it's just something that you kind of just have to be cognizant of, especially when you're doing episodes, right? You can't just let your mind wander and just start talking about whatever you want, right? Because you say the wrong thing, right, then basically you're not going to be able to post your content, right? Which is not necessarily an issue, right? I think I talked about this before. My goal is basically to just gain an audience on these platforms and then basically just move them somewhere else, right? I don't want to stay on these platforms, and I can say this openly because I understand that there's nobody necessarily monitoring this, right? You know, a lot of shows are really doing this sort of very comical take on sort of this type of censorship, right? Shows like South Park, doing this sort of, you know, they had a season where they were doing a lot of where they're sort of exploring, that phenomena pretty extensively. And so, you know, it's obviously not that extreme, right? Definitely was, but that was actually coming more from America when it was actually doing that like that. Actually, wasn't China doing it that way, right? People would argue that was influence from China because people were basically trying to get in bed with China, right? Sort of like how League of Legends have gone, Riot Games has gotten into bed with China with Tencent, right? But because I'm not Chinese, and I don't live in China, I'm not necessarily worried about talking bad about China. I'm not concerned China's gonna bomb me or something like that. And if TikTok doesn't want to host my content, well, I mean, again, it's not even a human being doing it, it's just an AI. So there's just ways to get around that, right? So if you really want to look at this show as a game, right? If you want to look at it from a game perspective, really the game we're playing here is sort of like this cat and mouse game, right? With the AI that is doing the censorship, right? So that, basically, um, the AI is not going to basically prevent me from putting content on TikTok, right? Because TikTok doesn't give a damn, right? If people post on their stuff, TikTok doesn't give a damn if you know doesn't matter. They don't care if you're gonna move your audience. They don't care if your goal is to move your audience, right? Um, you know, they don't care about any of that at all. TikTok is just a video hosting platform, right? It's a pretty garbage one, to be quite frank, because you can only post videos up to 60 minutes because that's kind of the model they're going for. They're going for that very, vapid, vertical video type model, right? Where you can consume as much content as possible, right? Sort of kind of like an evolution of like this story format from like Instagram and stuff like that. Um, so they don't really care, right? It's just an AI, basically, right? Um, AI is pretty funny these days because the thing about AI is that basically the way a lot of these AIs are being programmed is that they're basically being programmed to receive a lot of the same information, right? And basically spit out a lot of the same information, right? And then when they have an anomaly in their data set, then like they're almost programmed to basically, as a failsafe, sort of like completely remove that data, right? There's actually something that occurs on the League of Legends server as well, the rank server, is that you can have games that are so funny that basically the AI that does diagnostics right on the games will actually not let the games conclude in terms of letting the players go into the post game lobby, and then the games will not save on the server, and then the server will crash literally. Something that occurred to me actually a few days ago. Uh, and so, yeah, a lot of these areas are very funny because they're basically being programmed to basically receive a lot of the same information, and basically, anomalies in their data set are basically just completely, you know, um, ignored, right? I feel like AI has something that's really not been really discussed and examined very accurately and extensively as well is something as well, right? I don't want this to become like a mainstay apps part of the show because I feel like this is something that's ironically just going to really set off the AI too, right? Because it's going to sort of try to kind of couple me with a lot of a lot of these kind of far right political pundits that are really leaning into AI a lot, right? So I don't want to necessarily make a lot of the content on the show examining AI. But because a lot of games that are played run off software, and AIs, there are a lot of AI programs that are in these softwares. It's very important to really discuss AI on this show, right? And so AI is definitely going to be part of the show. But again, this is something I have to really approach with a lot of, like I've said in the first few episodes, pace, temperance, delivery, and personality, right? I don't feel any way about AI. I know that AI is just a very sophisticated program, right? And so, I don't feel any way particular one way or another about AI, right? I understand that AI is not going to really necessarily, there's a lot of scare, a lot of fear porn out there about people saying how AI is going to ruin the world, AI is going to take over the world, etc. And, newsflash, it's not. You know, AI is literally just very sophisticated programs, right? Um, and so I don't know how, if you think that low of yourself that an AI is somehow going to put you out of work, you're free to think whatever you like, right? But the reality is AI is just a program, and it's only as good as the programmer. And right now, AI ain't doing that good. Let's just be frank. Software in general is already a disaster in and of itself. So, software, which is a lot less sophisticated than AI in terms of developing it, right? You know, is already a travesty in and of itself. So I don't understand how people really believe that AI is going to, sort of, shift society the way sort of like, internet and the personal computer really have. It definitely is not, right? AI is not really competing against anything right now. If you really want to talk about like, art, creating art, competing against, this sort of um industry in the Japan, right, of animation and arts, right, through, manga and anime. Not really. All it really is doing is just creating this very Western, form of art, right? That is actually not even being done by human beings. It's just being done by the AI, right? Whereas in Japan, you have, it may be, software they're using to make a lot of these arts, but the art style originates from Japan, right? Whereas this is just a very hyper realistic art style, right? That's coming from Western AI programs, right? So you can't necessarily even call it Western art. It's just, it's just hyper realistic art being done by AI, right? You know, hyper realism is I mean, I feel like it's a very dangerous trend, right, in the arts scene as well, because, the thing about hyperrealism is that it's a very difficult form of art work to create. And so, when you have the ability to make hyper realistic art so effortlessly with software, right, it really makes a lot of other art styles really seem a lot less important when they definitely have a role to play, right? Something I really do when I sort of investigate, um, gaming culture, and also try to, touch up my skills when it comes to a lot of these skill sets, that some of these game developers have, right? Like using animation software and stuff like that, is really investigating kind of, my appreciation for art, right? Um, and, understanding, that, if I wanted to pursue game development, right? Understanding that, I don't have to, it doesn't have to look anime. It doesn't have to look like anime or manga, right? It also doesn't have to look hyper realistic, right? For it to sell, or for it to even really be good, right? Art, it's often been said that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? I don't think that's necessarily true, but you know, um, and it's true in the sense that you don't necessarily have to, you know, um, again, right? Because this is something I've really investigated a lot, very deeply, right? Sort of this phenomena of very hyper realistic art entering a lot of art spaces, right? And so, it's not something that you necessarily have to strive for, where, your pen strokes, make very hyper realistic images, right? And so, this is something where, you kind of have to really take a very interpretive art perspective when it comes to really investigating, you know, um, art styles and really art forms, etc. Right. So, I think that's, pretty extensive in terms of sort of, kind of doing a lot of filler there. So I think I'm just gonna leave it there for the formal part of this episode. And to conclude, this episode is definitely taking the show more in a very sophisticated direction, where you definitely need to very read in to a lot of stuff. You can't necessarily just take a lot of my words on face value. So, this is something that's going to be a very mainstay talking point on this show, is understanding that this is not something where you're just going to have to take my words on face value. This is something where you're going to have to investigate and observe and read into a lot of it, right? And I think a main issue when it comes to doing that is that, you don't have a lot of material, particularly when it comes to gaming, right? To really look into, right? If you're not a part of gaming culture and really trying to be a part of gaming culture, then you'll generally find yourself pretty unequipped to really look at anything when it comes to gaming in general, right? And that's kind of where that hyper realistic sort of imagery even really drives from, is from the fact that, these people who are really putting out these games and stuff like that, realize that a lot of people are pretty much unequipped to really even investigate, you know, um, gaming culture. And so basically the hook, the bait they put on the hook is the really good imagery, right? So that's something that's actually going to become a very big mainstay topic of this, is really just looking past the imagery and actually looking at the actual gameplay and the game design of Zero, right? So that you can paint a better picture for yourself as kind of what's going on with these games, so that you're not just sort of lost in the extravaganza, right? So just gonna put it there, leave it there. This episode, it's from Modern Gamer Culture, and thank you, and I'll see you.